Thank you. Can you hear me all the way to the back? Yeah, I am a professional loudmouth, so. Hi, I'm Avdi. This is such a small conference, I feel like I've met practically anyone. Is there anybody who I haven't had a conversation with yet? All right, meet me after the talk, okay? I want to meet every single one of you before I go. So, I am very excited to be here. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conference. Can we get another hand for Jason and all his helpers? I am particularly excited to be here because this is where I was born. I spent like the first year of my life here, and then I spent most of my life in the Mid-Atlantic. But about 3 years ago, we thought, we decided that we wanted to move back to Tennessee. And we moved to the Knoxville area because we'd always wanted to live in the hills. We got ourselves a house in the woods in the hills. And, you know, when you get yourself a house in the woods, you start thinking about doing little homesteady things. Like, wouldn't it be nice to have fresh eggs every morning that you raised yourselves? And if you're going to have fresh eggs, you need chickens. And to have chickens, you need to have a chicken pen. And to have a pen, you need a fence. And to have a fence, you need fence posts. So I went out to the hardware store and I got myself a pile of fence posts. And I got one of these. This is a fence post driver. It's basically a pipe with one end closed, and you just slam it down over the fence post over and over again until you get it deep enough into the ground to stay there. Or at least that's the theory. Because it turned out that our ground was more rock than dirt. And so what I actually wound up with was a bunch of mangled fence posts. So I realized that I needed to iterate on this process. I needed a new approach. So that was okay. I got out my handy-dandy post hole digger and my mattock, and I started digging. And about an hour or so later, I had one hole. If you look carefully at the sides of this hole, I think you can see that I was actually digging through a rock for part of that. So this wasn't working out. I realized I needed to iterate on this process again. So I'm a nerd. I'm not really a yard person. So I did a little research on the internet, and I went out to the hardware store again, and I got myself one of these. It's called a post hole digger / tamping bar. It's basically a 6-foot steel rod that has been sharpened into a chisel at one end. And you use it with the fence post driver, and it makes a nice little focused hole that's just big enough for a fence post. And this thing worked great. In like 5 minutes, I could drive a hole that had taken me over an hour with my manual tools. So I went around and I put in all my fence posts, but unfortunately, some of the early ones that I put in turned out to be not quite in the right spot. And so I realized that not only did I need to drive some fence posts into the ground, there were also a few that I needed to pull back out. And then it was at that point that I discovered I had another problem, which is that once you finally managed to get fence posts into this ground, it did not want to let them go. And so I did a lot of tugging and puffing and accomplishing nothing. And finally, I gave up and I went out to the hardware store and I got myself one of these. And this is a fence post puller. And it's basically just a big lever. And this thing worked great. It took like 30 seconds to accomplish what was completely impossible under my own power. Now, both of these tools that I've just shown you are examples of leverage. They're examples of things that allow you to apply a minimum amount of effort to achieve a maximum impact in the world. And that makes me think about software. Why do we write code? The typical answer to that, the answer that I hear most often is to solve problems. And I think this is okay as far as it goes. I mean, some of the things that we apply software to really do seem like problems to be solved. Like maybe you need to factor some large numbers, or you've got a photo of a suspect that you need to sift through like millions of photos to find other instances of it. And those really seem like puzzles to be solved. But in my experience, a lot of the work that we do with software is not anything like, it's not really puzzles to be solved. It's really more about effecting some kind of change in the world. A change in how we work, or how we play, or how we communicate with each other, or how we coordinate with each other. And code can be a very high leverage tool to accomplish change in the world. You know, when we first learn to code, it can feel like we've acquired superpowers. It feels like we have this army of robots at our command, just doing our bidding. You know, we write the code once, and then they do it over and over and over again. And this is really heady stuff. It's empowering. And as Americans, we know that when something is good, more of it is always better. Except sometimes not so much. Because what we also discover as we mature as programmers is that the code we write can start to have diminishing returns. Raise your hand if you've ever worked for 2 weeks on a piece of code that never saw the light of day in production. Keep your hand up if you've done that for 2 months. Wow. 6 months? Oh, man. There was still a couple of hands up there. See, code can sometimes be waste. It can be wasted. The time that we spend on it can be wasted. My grandfather was a dentist, and I grew up with a bunch of dental paraphernalia around the house. And there was always this magnet on our refrigerator that said, "Ignore your teeth, and they'll go away." And in one of my early programming jobs, I discovered that something similar could be said about programming tasks, because I would be diligently working away at something that they had tasked me with for weeks at a time, and then they'd come through and say, "Oh yeah, the contract changed, we're not going to be using that." And I'd have to shelve it. And what I discovered was that I could often just ignore the tasks that they gave me, because like 50% of them would just go away before they ever came due. Now, some shops are going to be more like this than others. Some shops, you're not going to have this problem so much. But there are a lot of reasons that code can go to waste. And code can also be a distraction to us. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Back in 2001, I had been in the software industry for a few years, and this was an exciting time for me. I was using all the slack time I had from ignoring programming tasks that people were giving me to learn all these new programming languages like Perl and Python and Ruby, and I was messing around with Linux in my spare time. And I was reading this awesome book called The Pragmatic Programmer. I was getting involved in the community around that book. It was super exciting, and if you remember, 2001 was also like the heyday of the blogging revolution. Suddenly everybody had to have a blog. And this would have been a perfect time for me to start my developer blog and start writing about the stuff that I was learning about, and start building up my programmer profile. And I wanted to do this, and here's how it would go. I would think to myself, hey, I have something to say. I have an opinion about software. I should write a blog post, which means I'm going to need a blog. All right, so let's check out the blogging tools that are out there. None of the blogging tools work quite the way I want them to. That's okay, I'm a programmer. I'll write my own blogging tool. So let's see, what kind of features do I want to have in a blogging tool? Well, I know I want to have it so that when I attach an image to a post, it'll resize it down so that it'll download quickly over a 28.8 modem, because obviously you need that. So let's check out what kind of imaging libraries are out there for Ruby right now. Oh man, this imaging library has a bug in it. That's okay, I'm a programmer, I can fix it. I'll just grab the code and oh man, I can't even get the test to pass. Like, how am I going to fix this bug if I can't get the test to pass? Wait a minute, what was I going to write about again? I went through this cycle for 5 or 6 years until finally in 2007, I bit the bullet and I set up a WordPress blog, and I finally wrote my first developer blog post. And you know, Caleb was talking about WordPress yesterday. We're going to go, you're going to see this is a bit of a recurring theme in this talk. It's that worse is better thing, right? So even when we stay focused, though, even when we're not distracted by code, code can still be a liability. And this is something that a lot of people have written about over the years. Chris Parsons says, every line you add limits your project's responsiveness to change. Tim Ottinger wrote, having more code will reduce your ability to incorporate new programmers. Of course, you'll need more programmers because you have all this code to deal with. Size has a cost. Rich Skrenta writes, code is bad. It rots. The more code you have, the more places there are for bugs to hide. Jeff Atwood, the best code is no code at all. And Eric Lee says, source code is merely the necessary evil that's required to create value. So code has downsides. Code can be waste. Code can be a distraction. Code can be a liability. And the thing is, we're not really here to write code. Code is just one source of the leverage that we need to affect change in the world. And over the years, I've started to learn some strategies for avoiding code, or at least avoiding unnecessary code, or at the very least, putting code off until I absolutely can't avoid it anymore. And I want to talk to you about a few of those strategies today. And along the way, I also want to talk about some of the mindsets, or some tips for mindset that will help you apply these strategies. Strategy number 1, do the work manually. Let's say you're writing an ebook and you have a publishing process you need to go through. You've got some files that are in a manuscript format that you like to write in, and you need to first export those files into HTML. And then after that, you need to upload the HTML to a CMS. Oh, look, there's WordPress again. So what do? Well, you're a programmer, you know. You jump right in and you start writing some automations. Maybe you write them in Rake. So you have a Rake task that exports the manuscript files into HTML. You have another Rake task that handles the upload to your CMS. And then after you write these, and after you have this working and uploading HTML, you discover a small problem. You discover that the HTML that your editor exports from those manuscript files is kind of messy. It has a bunch of divs and IDs and classes that mess up the formatting when it shows up on the site. And so you start writing some more code. You start writing a series of methods which will take the HTML and they'll fix some aspect of it, and they'll remove some aspect of that messiness. And eventually you have a whole list of these methods that you run, that you pipeline this HTML through, and at the end of that pipeline, you have nice, pristine HTML. But now let's rewind. And let's say that at the beginning of this process, you decided not to automate quite yet. You decided that you're going to just do the work manually a few times before you get started with automation. And so you go into your editor and you manually export your manuscript files to HTML. And you manually select this code and copy it and then you paste it into your CMS. And at that point, it's at that point that you realize that the HTML is kind of messy, and it messes up the formatting. And so you start manually going through and fixing it. And it sucks. It's painful. It's tedious. And pretty soon you get really tired of it, and you sit back and you think, man, there has got to be a better way. And then you're reflecting and think, wait a minute, didn't I read somewhere that it's possible to make WordPress accept Markdown? And so you do a little research and you find the setting in the Jetpack plugin that enables Markdown parsing instead. And you go back to your editor and you export Markdown instead of HTML. And of course it's Markdown, so it doesn't have any of those messy extra divs or classes or IDs. And you plonk it into your CMS, and you render it, and it looks fine the first time. And so there is this whole list of HTML munging methods that you never had to write. And the only reason that you discovered that is because you made yourself feel the pain of doing it manually first. That was what drove you to find that alternate solution. See, the thing is, given a tedious, repetitive problem, a programmer will say, I can automate this, right? That's like the first thing that we turn to. Now they have N problems. Or for the CS nerds among you, now they have NP problems. There are a lot of advantages to doing the work manually, at least at first. It gives you an opportunity to discover shortcuts, like that Markdown shortcut, before we make a psychological commitment to the code that we're writing, before we get into one of those sunk cost fallacies where, you know, we're already halfway there, we've already got it partly implemented, we might as well just keep going. Sometimes we find out that the task just isn't worth automating. Maybe we actually only need to do it once or twice. Doing the work manually can give us a chance to discover which cases are common and which are rare. And this is really valuable because a lot of times when we just have a list of requirements, all of the requirements, all the cases in those requirements seem equally important. But if we do the work manually, often we discover that some of those cases are super rare, and maybe there's a way we can just punt on those instead of spending a ton of time writing code for them. It is a lot easier to learn about a process if all you're doing is doing it manually than if you're trying to learn about it and also automate it at the same time. And then if you ever do choose to automate it, all that experience of doing it manually is going to make it a whole lot easier because you're going to understand the process inside and out. And the mindset that I want you to take away from this part is the idea of being code averse. I think we're usually the opposite of this. I think we're usually pretty code happy. You know, because code is fun, and code is what we do. And code holds the promise of ease. It often feels like it's going to be easier if we just start writing code to automate something than if we do that painful manual labor. But I want to encourage you to switch that around and be code averse and say, is there a way to avoid writing code for this, at least for now? Strategy number 2 I want to talk to you about. Embrace commodities. And what I mean by this is basically embrace off-the-shelf software. So some of you may know that I produce a series of screencasts on Ruby and object-oriented design and testing and all kinds of good stuff like that. How many people are subscribed to this? Thank you so much. This literally is what supports my family, so I really, really appreciate it. When I first put this site together, I wanted to get it done in a hurry, and so I used a hosted service. But the hosted service was missing a lot of features that I wanted to have. And so for a long time, I knew I really wanted to move to some other system. And for years, I worked on something that I thought of as RubyTopus 2.0, something that I would implement that would have all the features that I wanted it to have. And every time I got some free time, I would do a little more code on this. And as I was doing this in the background, I discovered that there were a lot of features that I needed to implement. I mean, there were subscriptions, there were sending out emails, there's streaming video, and there's downloading video, and there's showing the episode scripts in a really nicely formatted way, and search and categorization. I wanted to have courses and, of course, RSS feeds. And I discovered that this could easily become, just implementing this, could easily become a full-time job. And I realized that the implication of this fact was that Ruby Tapas, the show, could easily become about nothing other than implementing Ruby Tapas, the site, because that's all I'd be thinking about all day. And so that's all I'd be talking about on the show. And I realized that actually was not what I wanted the show to be about. But I had this voice in the back of my head saying, but don't I have to eat my own dog food? I mean, I'm a programmer. I'm talking about programming. If I don't run my site on code that I wrote, then I'm a hypocrite. And you've probably heard this phrase before, eat your own dog food. You know, the idea that you should be using the software that you write, because otherwise it's not going to be very good. But there is a very important caveat to this rule, which is you should only be eating your own dog food if your business is making dog food. And the inverse of this rule is not true. So just because you own a dog does not mean you should be making dog food. And so I took a step back and I thought, okay, what is the change that I actually want to affect in the world? And it was very simple. I want to make Ruby programmers better at what they do. That was it. The thing is, in the software that we write, there's usually some part of it which is the core of it. It is the core of our business. And then there are parts of it that are kind of at the periphery. They're around the edges. Don't spend your time writing code at the periphery if you can avoid it. And in thinking about this, I decided I was going to make a new rule for myself. New rule was, I will not write a single line of code to sell or deliver content. So I threw away my code base that I'd been developing over the years. But this meant that I needed a new solution which was off the shelf, but also flexible enough and extensible enough to give me all the features that I wanted to add. And there were a few candidates for this, but there was one that really stood head and shoulders above all the others. Something that I had experience with before, and that was WordPress. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of facts about WordPress, but I'll basically just say that WordPress is the 800-pound gorilla of the content management system world. It currently powers about 26% of the entire web, and that number is growing. It has an enormous ecosystem of developers, of plugins and extensions, hosts, themes, and there's a great community around it. WordPress is about as commoditized as it gets. But what about Rails? Why would I not implement this site in Rails? Well, it turns out that asking that question is similar to the question, why not write the site in pure Ruby? Like, you know, any enterprise website you could create in just pure Ruby without bringing Rails in. But Rails takes away 80% of the tedious, busy work that you really don't want to be spending your time on for the average enterprise website. Well, the same is true of WordPress for content management systems. You could implement your content management system on top of Rails. But for that application, WordPress takes away 80% of the tedious, busy work that you don't want to be bothered with. So when it comes to publishing rich content to the web, you can keep using the tool that you know, or you can use a focused tool that's designed for that job. And after years of using this for various solutions, I've become a little bit opinionated about this. And I'm going to say something that might be a little bit contentious. And it's this. If your business has a significant content management aspect, in other words, if you are doing news posts, or you're doing product listings, or you have some kind of portfolio, or you're taking classified ads, something like that, real content management stuff, if that's a significant part of your business and you are not using WordPress, then you're doing it wrong. And by that I mean you are wasting your time and money or somebody else's. Now I know that there are going to be a lot of objections to that. Some of you might have objections around like how are we going to integrate it with the rest of our systems. Security, I've heard that WordPress has a lot of security issues. I would be happy to talk to you about that stuff after this talk. But there's one objection that I want to talk about right now. But Avdi, it's written in PHP, and PHP is icky. And this is a serious problem. This is something that really gave me pause in considering this solution. But I've discovered a technique that deals with this problem. And it's this. Seriously, get over yourself. Technology bias will stunt your career. It is bad for you. And I feel like I can speak about this because I've had a lot of technology bias over the course of my career. And there's something that I've learned along the way, which is that when you see a whole lot of people using a technology that you think is objectively bad, there are two possibilities. Either you are right and everybody else is stupid, or you're missing something important. And here's a hint, it's never number one. And if you're worried that because it's written in a language that you don't really fancy working in, and so you're not going to be enthused about tweaking the code, well, what was the point of this exercise in the first place? Oh yeah, avoiding code. So that's a feature. There's one other thing I want to talk about that's kind of interesting and unique about the WordPress ecosystem. You all know what it's like, a lot of you probably know what it's like to submit a ticket to an open source project when you run across a bug. Ernesto was talking about this yesterday. If you're lucky, you'll get a note that says, hey, thanks for letting us know. We'll take a look at it when we get a chance. And this is exactly the response that you should be getting, because Ernesto is maintaining that library, and Ernesto needs to spend time with his baby daughter. This is how open source is supposed to work. I am not faulting open source projects or maintainers for responding in this way. But it can be kind of problematic when your business runs on this code and you don't have the resources or the bandwidth to become an expert in every single library and every single gem that your business depends on. And there's this interesting phenomenon in the WordPress ecosystem where there are all these plugins that they're open source, they are GPL'd code, but there's a pro version, and it might add some extra features or automatic updates or something like that, but the real thing that you're paying for when you pay for the pro version is support. And I've paid for a number of these plugins over the years, and I've actually had cause to use the support contract for most of them. And my experience has been universally fantastic. People have gotten right back to me. They've dug in and figured out what the issue was that I had. Sometimes they've put up new betas just for me, just so I can try it out. Because they have an incentive. They have a reason to do that, because I'm paying them for their labor. And this, it's interesting to me that in the WordPress world, there are a lot of open source maintainers who have at least a decent sideline doing pro support for their open source code. And this is really kind of absent from the Ruby ecosystem. I can think of maybe one gem that uses this kind of model, and that's kind of strange to me. So one of the tips I want to give you for embracing commodities is the idea of paying for software. And I know this may sound a little strange in this age of open source everything, but it can be awfully worthwhile sometimes. And the mindset tip that I have for you for this idea of embracing commodities is one that's really, really important. It's the idea that you need to not be precious. The biggest objection that I see to embracing commodities, to using off-the-shelf software, is always it's not going to work exactly the way we need it to. And no, it's not. There's going to be something different about the workflow. There's going to be something different about the file formats it uses, something. But a lot of times, being a little bit flexible can be very, very worth it in being able to use something off the shelf that you don't have to maintain. And a lot of times what you find out is that the reason it doesn't work the way you think it should is because they have a lot more experience building that kind of software, and they've tried different ways of doing it, and they've discovered the workflows that work, or the file formats that work, or what have you. So don't be precious. The third strategy I want to talk to you about is the idea of looking for partial solutions when you write code. Look for ways for your code to be one piece of the puzzle instead of the whole solution. There's a style of coding that I've found is conducive to finding partial solutions, and it's a style I call externalizing intermediate states. So I've got some scripts that I run on my machine that help me to upload episodes to the site. And I wrote those scripts in Rake. And the thing about Rake is it really encourages a style of coding where each step in a process is represented and is finalized in the form of a file. So at the end of that step, a file is written that has some kind of information that's collected. It might just be a timestamp. It might be something more elaborate. And that's when you know, that's how you know the step is done. And that's how it calculates its dependencies. And this lends itself really to this idea of partial solutions, because there was this feature that I wanted to add recently, which is having an iTunes feed of downloadable videos for certain members. And so I was using off-the-shelf software. I was able to find a plugin that would do this without me writing any extra code, but it added a new field that I needed to fill in in order to post new episodes. And I didn't yet have automation for filling in that field. But what I discovered was that I had the information that I needed for that field right there in one of those files that Rake leaves behind when it finishes its upload process. And so I realized, you know what, for right now, I can just dump this file out of the terminal. I can copy the URL that I need, and I can paste it in. And then later on, I can automate it. But because the tool was externalizing its intermediate states along the way, this information was very easy for me to access. And in a way, this turns your code from a black box into kind of a dialogue with you. And we can embrace this idea of code as a dialogue more explicitly. In my publishing code, I also have some code that needs to select the video to be uploaded. And most of the time it works fine, but occasionally it gets confused because I've got some extra video file lying around, and it happens to also match the file globbing expression, and so now it has two options. And there were a few ways I could have handled this. You know, I could have just had it fail hard every time that happened, just crash. I could have kept encoding more and more careful rules about identifying the right file into that code as these cases came up. But I decided to go with option 3, which is just make it prompt me. If it has more than one option, make it prompt me and ask me. And it comes up rarely enough that this is a good enough solution, and it handles all of the possibilities. Anytime it gets confused, it just asks me. And you don't have to do this at a command line prompt. There are a lot of different ways to do this in your code. You can have it send you an email when it's not sure how to proceed with something. You can have it drop a note in Slack. You could write a chatbot, like Daniel was talking about yesterday, and have it interactive, so maybe you can actually answer the note in Slack and tell it what to do. You can have your software generate a new ticket in your project management system if there's some ambiguous case that it can't handle. Make your code into a dialogue with you, and then you don't have to write so much of it. And this kind of reminds me of the fence post puller, because that fence post puller it gave me more leverage than my bare hands. But it was less leverage than some custom-built diesel-powered automatic fence puller. It was just enough leverage, and that's what we're shooting for here. And the mindset I want you to take away from this part is treat your code as a collaborator. Kind of like Ben was saying this morning, only he was talking about code being, the compiler being a collaborator at coding time. But you can also make your code into a collaborator with its users or with you at runtime. Make your code something that works with you and alongside you, instead of this black box that's supposed to punch out complete solutions. I want to talk to you about one more strategy for avoiding code, and that is to use non-code tools. So I had a project that I needed to do recently. I had a system I needed to build. I needed to build a system for managing chores in our household. I've got 4 little children, and I needed them to start pulling their weight. So I decided that I was going to start this system by prototyping it. And in order to prototype it, I decided to use the most popular programming system in the world, a spreadsheet. And so I started out by just filling in a big master list of all the chores that I felt like needed to be done around the house. And this was really easy. Spreadsheets make this stuff really easy because they're schema lists. You can just sort of make up your schema as you go along. And then once I had filled in the list, I sorted it by the frequency of how often these chores needed to be done. And I realized something, which is that most of the chores needed to be done weekly or more often. There were just a few of them that were in the monthly category. So I decided to throw out the monthly ones for now, just punt on that, and focus on all these weekly ones. And at that point, I decided I needed a new view in this system. So I decided to prototype a new view, which would be a grid that would break down the chores by day and by child. And I wrote an elaborate algorithm to take chores from that master list and distribute them fairly across this grid. Just kidding, I filled it in manually. I just copied them and pasted them in. And I used my judgment and my knowledge of the children and their capabilities, and I started filling this in. And sometimes it would start to feel a little bit unbalanced towards one child. And because I was doing this in a spreadsheet, it was really, really easy to just drag and drop chores from one slot to another and balance it out until it looked right. So this was great. I had a nice overview of the whole week, broken down by child. But my end users are children ages 2 through 9, and I knew that they needed a more approachable view. So it was time to prototype one more view in this system. And for this final view, I decided to use a word processor document. And I messed around with a few different options for how to lay it out, and I finally settled on a page per day broken down by kid. And I started filling this in and filling it in, and eventually I discovered that I was kind of making poor use of space, and I was overflowing off the bottom. But the thing is, because I was using a word processor, it's such a nice midpoint between content and layout that it was really, really easy to play around with different layouts until I found one that nicely fit the information in a way that I liked. And I was able to do this rearranging much faster than I would have been able to do either in like a Photoshop comp or in HTML and CSS. And I was able to keep my focus on the content as I was doing this. So I had this final view, and I needed to choose a platform for delivering this to the end users. And for that platform, I chose good old ink on paper. And this had some interesting properties because, of course, there were bugs in the initial rollout. There were things that were misplaced or just didn't work right. And because it was on paper, it was easy to make modifications in production. And it turned out that the end users had a lot of annotations and commentary to make on this. And if you think about this, This capability is extremely uncommon in the systems we deliver, in either the prototypes we deliver or the final systems we deliver. This ability to directly annotate the system as it's in use. The best we usually have is that they can take a screenshot and scribble on the screenshot. It also gave me a very convenient place to write down notes for the next iteration. You know, I didn't need a separate bug tracking system. I could just flip it over and start scribbling them down. I could do it right there on the work artifact. And I learned some useful things as we were using these prototypes in practice, because I learned that some chores have temporal dependencies. Some chores would sort of deadlock on the sink, and they needed to be moved around. And so this taught me something very important about the system I was developing, which is that I would always need to be able to manually reorder chores. It was not going to be sufficient to just list them in terms of their name or in terms of when they were added to the system. I needed to be able to move them around. And so in the end, I had identified 3 screens in my prototype. I had a master list of chores, I had a grid by day and child, and then I had this end user view, which was daily pages broken down by child. So I had a really good idea of the system that I needed to build. But I also had learned something else, which is that maybe what I had was good enough. Maybe it was good enough to just print this out every week, or maybe laminate it and use some dry erase markers. You know, I think very often when we jump straight into prototyping a system with whether it's Photoshop comps or whether it's an HTML and CSS mockup or maybe an actual skeletal software system, a lot of times I think we kind of do both too much and too little at the same time, because we can spend a lot of time on those things, and what we end up with is an artifact that is not malleable. We can take commentary on it, but what we can't do is we can't watch the end users bend that artifact to their purposes. Whereas if we allow ourselves the option of starting out with something like a spreadsheet or a document or even pen and paper, it gives us that opportunity to watch people experiment, you know, because these are formats, they aren't just accessible to everyone, but they're writable by everyone. And the mindset I want you to take away here is the idea that really we're not building software systems. We're not here to build software systems. What we do is we create systems of work that are often supported by software. But what we're creating is the workflows. What we're creating is the way of thinking of the work. And this brings me around to the point of this talk. Our goal is to have maximum impact on the world. And to do that, we look for tools with leverage. But unfortunately, often we get fixated on the code part of that. We get fixated on code as our go-to tool. And the thing is, we have very valuable skills, and the world needs those skills. You know, Kinsey was talking about this, how there are really important things that need to be done in the world, and we have the skills to do some of that stuff. But sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, because we love to code, and it's the thing that we turn to first. We can get distracted by code. And I am not here to tell you to stop doing this thing that you love. It's really about focusing your coding efforts on the areas that will have the greatest impact in the world and avoiding the areas that are just going to be wasted, or the areas that are just going to leave you on the hook for endless maintenance at the periphery of your system. You know, as a new programmer, the ability to code feels like a superpower. It gives you great leverage at first, but as experienced programmers, we find that the ability to refrain from coding can also be a superpower. You know, we call ourselves hackers, or at least some of us do. And when you look at the origin of that term, it comes from the MIT hack culture, which is this culture of doing these pranks. And they were pranks, they were pranks in the real world. Hacking means effecting changes in the real world, like turning the MIT dome into R2-D2 overnight. Remember the point of what we're doing. It's to effect change in the world, not just to code up features, but to effect change in the world, whether that change is to have fresh eggs every day, or whether it's to distribute millions of fresh eggs to thousands of stores using some kind of inventory software, or whether it's just getting your kids to do their chores. Remember, the point is to effect change in the world. Like Ernie was saying, what is the why here? Sometimes code is our high leverage tool for effecting change in the world, and sometimes it isn't. But either way, the change that we make in the world, that's where the fun is. And so I want to encourage you to go out there and effect some change in the world, or as I prefer to say it, happy hacking, everyone. Thank you very much. I want to make one quick shameless self-promotion note here. As I was composing this talk, I realized that I had a ton of content on my hands that I couldn't use, that I had to cut out. And so I'm going to be publishing that in some other form that I haven't completely settled on yet. But if you're interested in that, check out the URL, and there's an email sign-up form. But that's it. Again, thank you so much. Happy hacking.